Welcome, everybody. This is the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley. Every week, we bring you the stories of people making a difference in the lives of others around the world. These are people who are improving their communities locally, globally, and digitally. This happens because, in our case, we're part of Rotary International, 1.2 or 3 or something million people around the world, in 36,000 clubs, all of whom ascribe to a motto, service above self. And in the spirit of figuring out ways to make the world better, one of our goals is to share the stories of people who have important and fascinating things to say. Certainly, we have found a very important topic for you for this week. Our speaker is Diane Shader Smith. And Diane is a communications professional and an AMR advocate. And if that doesn't kind of clue you in as to what we're about to talk about, you might pause the video or the podcast, go on to the page containing it, and read the full description, including the bio. But we are really honored to have her, and I am so excited to have you tell your story to the members and guests of the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley. Diane, I hand the mic over to you.
Thank you so much. Today, I'm going to take you on a journey through the intertwined worlds of antimicrobial resistance, phage therapy, and my daughter's writing to illustrate how stories help inspire people to think differently. It's certainly true with AMR, which stands for antimicrobial resistance, one of the top global health threats facing humanity, according to the World Health Organization. My interest in all this started back in 1995, when I was a young working mom and my daughter Mallory was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis. How do you tell your 3-year-old that she has a life-altering lung disease, that she'll need to inhale multiple medications every day and do chest percussion therapy? There was no children's book back then to explain it, so I wrote one, Mallory's 65 Roses, because 65 roses is what kids hear when adults say cystic fibrosis. This book taught Mallory the power of narrative. My daughter had a happy childhood with no significant health challenges until she was colonized by Burkholderia caenosepacea, bacteria known for its resistance. Suddenly, Mallory had an expiration date. She started writing to process her feelings. These are her words. I didn't realize that my chance encounter with an opportunistic pathogen was like walking up to the devil's vending machine. I gave up my life as I knew it, and in return, I was left with the sinking and undeniable reality of my mortality. Null and void, erased. Cepacia entered the microbial ecosystem of my lungs uninvited, waiting until my body was vulnerable to make its move. Microscopic armies of these bacterial cells then marched in and set up camp. During my first hospitalization at the start of 7th grade, my medical team came into my room to talk through the treatment plan after they had already started me on a cocktail of IVs. It would happen this way with each subsequent admission. Routinely in this order, cultures were taken, antibiotics were prescribed, drug susceptibility tests were performed, cocktails were altered. This contributes to resistance. Faster diagnostics would have helped stave off this issue, which is another critical part of antibiotic stewardship. Mallory developed a mantra, live happy. She was family-oriented, a straight-A student, and 3-sport varsity athlete. Senior year in high school, Mallory got very sick. Her words, as the days wear on, I find myself panicking as I grow more oxygen dependent, experiencing pain with breathing, no longer able to walk without help. But outside of the hospital, life goes on. I'm afraid I won't make it to my prom. But Mallory did, and to her surprise, she was voted prom queen. It was an incredible evening until the after party when some idiot threw a smoke bomb into the venue. Mallory's throat started to burn. Her lungs were searing. Her eyes and her nose were watering. And then hemoptysis, when the airways bleed. Terrifying moments like this had distilled for Mallory a profound understanding of how precarious life was. It's why she felt the need to document everything, to collect the wisps, the threads of her untidy happenings. Her words, as my bacteria becomes increasingly resistant, I grow decreasingly confident in the plans I had etched in my mental map until it's hard to remember they were ever there. I'm working very hard to see beauty in a life that looks quite different from the one I wanted, the one I expected. College presented new challenges because after growing up with a helicopter mom, Mallory was ready to be on her own. But it was a difficult transition, and she writes about the duck syndrome, when you're like a duck gliding on the water. What no one sees is that underneath you are paddling furiously. The stress of working to make things seem effortless creates a vicious cycle of silence and struggle. The crazy thing is that no one understood Mallory's distress because she still looked so healthy that everyone thought she was the golden girl who had it all. Mallory would have traded everything for the chance to take a breath that didn't hurt, to have a life that wasn't ravaged by resistant bacteria. Straddling the sick and the well worlds, Mallory understood that amplifying patient voices could have implications for society, which is why she spent 10 years documenting what it was like to live with bacteria that was a known killer. 67 hospitalizations led her to write, "Resistant bacteria does a lot of taking, of dreams, of time, of travel, of friendships, of freedom, of potential, of plans, of lives. It's a complex, unpredictable, irreversible, progressive, painful, suffocating, choking weed." When I developed a fungal infection, things got even more complicated and emotionally traumatic. I used to have fun. I used to be fun, but now I'm afraid of everything, of being myself, but also of losing who I am. That the choices I make are going to cut my life short. I'm going to be on IVs for the rest of my life, and that is very hard on the liver. I'm afraid I won't be happy. I won't have friends or a significant other. And sex with a PICC line or an IV drip? Ugh. I am afraid I will always just be that sick girl. And yet Mallory persevered, graduating from Stanford Phi Beta Kappa, ready to take on the world. But sadly, doctors said no. She couldn't do environmental field work, which was her dream, because it would further damage her lungs. Mallory was devastated, but she had to move on. So instead, she got hired to write a book, The Gottlieb Native Garden, a California love story about the importance of environmental stewardship. It was a huge success. As Mallory's body deteriorated, she sharpened her mind, crystallized her thinking, honed her writing skills, and hoped to find love. And it was New Year's Eve of 2015 when Mallory met Jack, who I call her real-life Prince Charming. They were having so much fun, but then suddenly Mallory was back in the hospital. The antibiotics had stopped working, and the only option left was transplant. The approval meant a cross-country move, since the University of Pittsburgh was the only medical center willing to take her complicated case. Mallory had to say goodbye to everyone, knowing she might not make it back. And that day, as we were headed for the airport, there were so many tears. Once in Pittsburgh, Mallory struggled to breathe. She struggled to stay hopeful. She worried that her bacteria would kill her before new lungs arrived, that she would end up in the ICU clinging to life. If that happens, she writes, I want to be as comfortable as possible through opioids or anti-anxiety meds, but not be so out of it that I'm unconscious unless the pain is severe enough to necessitate that. I want to maintain dignity to whatever extent possible, to receive whatever life-saving treatment is appropriate, to be able to communicate in some way, to have the blinds open for natural light, to have calming music to listen to have my mom or my dad with me always. I want to live. The call for lungs finally came, but it was a false alarm. And many months later, after the fourth attempt, her surgery was a go. Despite her fears, Mallory was so excited to receive the gift of life, new lungs. The recovery was grueling, but 1 month later, Mallory was celebrating her birthday, her 25th birthday, without supplemental oxygen. But just a few weeks later, the cepacia was back, and the doctors told us it was fully resistant. Mark had heard about an epidemiologist named Stephanie Strathley who had saved her husband with phage therapy. So Mark went in search of this treatment. Meanwhile, at the doctor's urging, our closest friends and family gathered. Because Mallory was on a ventilator, she scribbled this note, which reads, "Can't talk at all, but so grateful you were all here for the hardest part." During this time, the United States Navy was quietly working on a treatment for an invisible enemy they called Iraqibacter, resistant bacteria that was causing serious infections to military personnel wounded in battle. Herculean efforts enabled the United States Navy to prepare and deliver a match for Mallory's isolate of Cepacia. That night, Mallory became the first patient in the United States with cystic fibrosis to receive phage therapy under the FDA's compassionate use provision. But the very next morning, the doctors said that Mallory had been without oxygen for too long and advised us to make the gut-wrenching decision to remove life support. Saying goodbye to Mallory was impossible. But then the autopsy report came back, revealing that the phages had started to work. Mallory just didn't get them in time. Mark couldn't save his daughter, but he was certain phage therapy could save others. So we shared Mallory's story with the media. We urged the medical community to take a closer look at phages, and we raised money to make the inaugural grant to IPATH, which is now leading the first ever NIH-funded trial using phage therapy. While Mark went dipping for phages in a sewage treatment plant, I finally read Mallory's diary for the first time, and I worked with Random House to have her writings published posthumously as Salt in My Soul, which led to the documentary of the same name. Was it fate or divine intervention when the largest study to date about superbugs was published in The Lancet on the very same day the New York Times referred to Salt in My Soul as an awareness-raising tool about the possibility of bacteriophage? And then Forbes writer Judy Stone penned the headline, "Poignant Film Calls Attention to the Need for Phages for Antibiotic Resistance." Since Mallory is no longer here and can't share her wisdom, I do so on her behalf every chance I get, at medical schools, conferences, corporations, community events, Capitol Hill, the White House, the UK, Australia, the European Commission, and NATO. What's shocking is that most people have never heard of AMR, or they don't understand it. They are confused by what I call the alphabet soup of acronyms. The World Health Organization uses AMR for antimicrobial resistance. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention has been using AR for antibiotic resistance. Doctors code DRI for drug-resistant infections, but when they talk, they use DR for drug resistance. And then try looking for a study in a medical journal, and you'll see MDR for multiply drug resistant. Our brains need clear concepts to make sense of things. Take cancer, for example. No matter the language, people understand. The sense of urgency comes because we are dangerously close to a post-antibiotic era. To a patient with a superbug, to a parent of a child suffering from resistant bacteria, to a healthcare provider trying to save the life of someone with AMR, there is nothing more important than finding treatments that will work against resistant bacteria. Mallory was only 12 when AMR came for her and derailed her life. She had so much to live for. Granted, Mallory was at higher risk because of her underlying diagnosis of CF, but Tori Kinnaman, a gymnast at Duke University, contracted a superbug in the athletic setting and almost lost her life. Katie Granger was a perfectly healthy woman who cut her finger on vacation. She ended up having her legs and her fingertips amputated. No one is safe, which is why Random House recently published Diary of a Dying Girl, an adaptation of Salt in My Soul, to reach an even wider audience. They are calling Mallory's second memoir an eye-opening exploration of a global global public health crisis. It's become the inspiration for the Global AMR Diary, collective storytelling to shift perspectives and shape policy, an initiative I started with the World Health Organization, the CDC, the ECDC, and many other global health leaders. The LA Times did a feature on this with the headline, "A Mother's Loss Launches a Global Health Effort," which has been helpful because when medicine and media align, there is an opportunity to amplify the message and mobilize public and political will towards change. Stories like Mallory can trigger the transformation in perception that will make this crisis feel real and help people grasp the need for immediate and effective action. Thank you.
Diane, my goodness.
Okay, I'm
What
trying
a-
to figure out
what
how
a
to
powerful-
stop this share.
Yeah, what a powerful presentation you've given. Thank you for sharing.
That's the shortest one I've ever done. I packed it into 30. Did I hit my mark?
You did fine.
Okay.
So I'd like to explore some of the medical issues that are inherent in the story. Is it the case that overuse of antibiotics is contributing to a rise in these kinds of cases?
Yes, misuse and overuse of antibiotics is one issue, but it's only one. There's many of them. But
Okay.
yes, the more we use these antibiotics inappropriately, the faster resistance will develop and the less drugs will be available to treat the infections that really need to be treated.
Well, I'm completely on board with your your thesis that the story is the powerful way to get people to act. And so if we look at some of those pieces of the puzzle, so overuse of antibiotics, if someone is trying to understand that who has kind of a limited knowledge of medicine, is there something in particular that that you use as an example to help people go, this is where this happens, and then we can move into some of the other examples.
Yeah, mom goes to the pediatrician, her kid's got a cold. He doesn't seem to be getting better fast enough, and she asks for an antibiotic.
Okay.
That's a perfect, simple, easy to understand example.
Yeah, all right. And you mentioned that there are other things that are contributing to antibiotic overuse.
There are a whole bunch. One of them is the animal husbandry industry where they inject animals with antibiotics to make them bigger, grow better. And you sometimes see antibiotic-free packaging in the market, and that's what people should be eating. They should demand that the animals are not infused, for lack of a better word, with antibiotics.
And with regard to animal husbandry, is it the case that the industry just doesn't believe that it's enough of an issue to stop using these, or that there's some financial
I think
advantage to
that
continue?
it's a question of profits over, putting profits over the greater good. I think that one of the reasons I work hard to educate people about what AMR is that public pressure will change policy. That's what we need to go for. You asked what other issues are at stake here. So war, which we saw in Ukraine and now we have with Israel and Gaza, is a driver because when public health infrastructure breaks down, battleground where people get injured and there's no clean water and there's lack of an access to proper medication or treatment is a breeding ground for resistant bacteria. And then, in my longer talks, I show this series of slides where you see a soldier getting injured on the battlefield, you see the people picking him up and carrying him off, then you see the patient going into the hospital, and then the hospital is treated by a nurse, and then the nurse contracts the bacteria, takes it home to her husband gets on an airplane and flies. One of the things I say that I credit Richard Alm, who's I think he's the chief scientist for CARB-X, which is one of the most important groups working on all this. He says that the number of deaths from AMR is equivalent to a large jumbo jet crashing every 39 minutes. And I used to say this before the Boeing crisis in my talk. I would show a slide of a plane going up, and then I show a slide of the plane crashing. And I would say government would never tolerate this level of fatality from any other industry, but they're ignoring AMR. And then all of a sudden we have the Boeing crisis. And after 2 or 3 problems, all of a sudden Boeing is all over the news, but AMR is not. And the number of deaths from AMR is just so much higher exponentially, and it's shocking, but that's where education campaigns come in. That's where personal storytelling has to be employed as a tactic and a tool. And that's where resources like the Global AMR Diary will be helpful to share stories and aggregate all the stories that these global health leaders have been collecting in their silos, but not really getting them out to the mainstream public, which is why we're trying to raise awareness this way. And I'm using Diary of a Dying Girl as the platform to talk about the larger issues in addition to just talking about Mallory's story.
So are there particular initiatives within certain organizations or certain political efforts that have shown some promise? Where would someone interested in trying to figure out how to be a part of the solution go?
So the PASTOR Act is legislation that was introduced, and it's bipartisan. And the goal has always been every time a Republican signs on, a Democrat signs on. Every time a Democrat signs on, a Republican signs on. And they've been making progress. As a matter of fact, as we're recording this right now, there is an event on Capitol Hill trying to raise awareness for legislation. The problem is that if you create a drug like Lipitor or Viagra or Prozac or Ozempic, these drugs that people are going to go on and take for the rest of their lives, Big Pharma enters the field and they have a tremendous incentive to bring these drugs to market. With antibiotics, they become resistant. So we need drug companies to make drugs and put them on the shelf and leave them sitting there until the first line drugs don't work. Well, who wants to make a drug that they can't sell? So there have been market failures, and what they have decided, the people who are making this policy and trying to solve this problem, they've determined that we need a subscription style model like Netflix, where drug companies are paid to develop drugs that we don't deploy so that they will be available for when resistance strikes. But it hasn't passed. It's pending. And this is the third year now, I think. I think it was introduced in 22, it was introduced in 23, and now we're in 24. And, in an election year, it's very hard to get anything passed. But people that work in AMR are lobbying hard and trying to get this on people's radar. So, yeah. And the way people should pay attention, they should not ask their doctor for an antibiotic. If their doctor prescribes them an antibiotic, they should ask what they're prescribing for. That pattern with Mallory with cystic fibrosis, which is they start them immediately on a cocktail, then they do the drug susceptibility tests, and then they change the cocktails. That's a really big driver of resistance because, they say you have to finish all your antibiotics or else that's one of the consequences. Faster diagnostics is something that would help. And so there is a whole other area. We need more work done in diagnostics. I never thought about diagnostics. I never thought about AMR in terms of war or animal husbandry until I started speaking on very important global stages about Mallory and her story. And I was basically tapped to learn language that I could share in these audiences. So for example, here I am speaking to the E-Club of Silicon Valley. Hopefully we'll reach a wide audience. I'm not from the World Health Organization. I'm not a drug maker. I'm not a lobbyist. I'm not a researcher. I'm just a grieving mom who lost a daughter. And my daughter wrote a book that's very powerful and impactful and inspiring. And in my efforts to get people to raise awareness for the book, I have layered on and taken the job of becoming an AMR advocate very seriously. And I have been armed with language by the people at the highest levels, at the CDC, at the World Health, at CARB-X, at Partnership to Fight Infectious Disease. I meet with them, I speak to them, I get the important language that they want communicated, and I infuse it into my story. And that's why I keep getting invited, I think, to speak, because it's much more interesting to hear a mom who lost a daughter talk about AMR than a doctor who has charts and graphs.
One more medical question before we turn to.
I'm not a doctor. I'll do my best.
A medical reference, perhaps.
Okay.
You talked about the phage therapy that the might have been the Naval Research Laboratory had developed, showing some real promise in this regard. Is there anything on the near horizon that suggests that there's some tremendous hope here for addressing antimicrobial resistance through phage therapy?
Yes.
Why?
Okay. So when Mallory got her phages
Mhm.
in 2017, there was not one center in the United States that was doing phage therapy work in a formal way. Now there are 5 centers, and many more universities are doing research, and there are companies that have come into the marketplace. Adaptive Phage Therapeutics, ADP, yeah, ADP. They helped with Stephanie Strathy. They helped make those phages and get them for Mallory. And there are other companies as well. The issue is that it's hard to bring them to market. It's expensive. We know all the pitfalls that go with it. I will say that Mallory's autopsy did show proof of concept, and it has been used on a compassionate case basis. The perfect example of why I think there's not more traction. When the documentary came out, Ben Chan, Paul Turner, and Dr. John Koff at Yale were all working with phages. And I reached out to them and I said, can we do a screening at Yale? And they said, sure, we'd love to do that, because the documentary of Mallory's life goes more deeply into the phage story. And a lot of people don't read books, but they'll watch a movie, and the movie has done really well and people love it. It got 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. Anyway, Yale said they would do it. They sent an announcement out to 40,000 people in their database all over the world, because people wrote to me from England that I know and from Germany that had something to do with Yale. That's how you got this invitation. And I said to them, when are you going to formalize the work you're doing? And they said, oh, we established a center last year. I said, nobody in this country is speaking more prominently and out there about phage than me, because I've been speaking about phage since the day Mallory died. And I said, you have to bring her book to publication, because it's my platform to speak about phage therapy. I just started as a phage therapy spokesperson, not an AMR spokesperson, because I didn't even understand what it was. And they said, oh, well, yeah, that's an interesting idea. I did the publicity. I called the New England or the New Haven Register in and said, can we do a story on this documentary against the backdrop of this amazing center at Yale by these 3 amazing men who haven't taken the time to issue a press release about what they're doing? And that's when I realized, okay, I got to keep going, because these people who are solving the problems are not the people who are telling the stories or who are raising the awareness. And I gave a talk on the World AMR Congress stage 2 years ago, and I said, in 22, we need a global aha moment, that moment that people understand how many people have died and will die from AMR. And everybody was like, yeah. Then the next summer, in June of 2023, I spoke to the international CEOs of biotech in Boston. I live in California. And I said, okay, we need a global stunt. And I fleshed it out in a different environment with these biotech innovators. And they were all saying, yeah, what are we going to do? Then in September of 2023, I stood on the World AMR Congress in Philadelphia, and I said to the same people that these are the global health leaders working in the space of AMR. I said, and the policymakers and the lobbyists, I said, okay, this is what you need to do. Everybody keeps asking me, you need to bring in the storytellers in Hollywood and, make it all wrapped up into a package that people can understand. And it was like, yeah. But meanwhile, nothing's happening. Then when Random House asked me to work with this Diary of a Dying Girl, more of Mallory's story, doing a deeper dive into some of the mental health aspects and some of the previously unpublished journal entries, I thought, okay, this is my moment. I have a global moment here. Eyes are going to be on Mallory's book. How can I elevate that? And that's when I came up with the idea to do the the Global AMR Diary. And I went to these people and I asked them, and everybody said yes. The World Health said yes, the CDC, the ECDC. As a matter of fact, Dr. Dominique Monet, who's head of AMR for European CDC, he was my informal advisor, and Kevin Outerson, who is the executive director of CarbX, which is funded by the German government, the UK government, the United States government, the Bill Gates Foundation, and the Wellcome Trust. He's a really important visionary leader and thought leader in this space. I said to them, what do we do? And I call him my Henry Higgins, because he gave me all the language I needed to speak in the world. And they said yes. And all of a sudden, this initiative, which is a sort of a no-brainer, because the World Health had been collecting stories. The Partnership to Fight Infectious Disease has been collecting stories. The CDC has been collecting stories, but they're not coming together in one platform. And that's what the Global Diary is intended to do, and to take it beyond just the patients, because now everybody's really focused on patient stories, focus on the caregiver stories, focus on the provider stories, because trust me, the doctors who have run out of solutions do not like to tell patients like Mallory or parents like me, we can't help you anymore. You're resistant to every single treatment. That is a devastating thing. And the doctors have experienced excruciating trauma from knowing that there is a possible solution and not being able to do anything about it. So we need their stories. And then we need the biotech innovator stories, people who have chosen to pursue passion over profit, working at either nonprofits or working in the small startup world where, you know, they're scrounging for money and they're hoping to have enough of a runway to last another 6 months, trying to bring these drugs to market. We need those stories too, and then we need to share them. So I am in the process of writing an op-ed as a call to Hollywood to come out and tell these stories. So that's what we need to do, because the people who are solving the problems in the lab and taking care of patients in the hospital, or who are on Capitol Hill lobbying, they don't have time to go out there and do this kind of thing. And this is what we really need to be doing more of.
So the book, and for those watching the recording, whether you are on our webpage or on our podcast page or wherever you might be, you know, YouTube channel, I mean, you'll find the link to diaryofadyinggirl.com where you can learn more about the book. And I'm so struck by the work you do, and I'm also completely floored by the courage that Mallory had to keep writing, right?
I have
You know,
2,500 pages, 2,500 pages.
oh, so in telling these stories and giving space to people to understand the power of stories to make change, is there something about the style? I mean, you're a professional communications person. Like, is there something about her style that you think helps people go from merely understanding this in their head to truly understanding this and perhaps acting on what they have in their head by understanding it in their heart?
Well, I'm going to just say she's a storyteller. And what the example I use is a good writer can make a trip to the market to get milk really interesting, where you're on the edge of your seat. And a bad storyteller can have the most important story to tell. And if they don't know how to tell it, they'll lose the audience. And I've done panels with people where the person next to me has an amazing story, but they haven't figured out how to tell it. So one of the things that I do professionally is help people tell their stories as a publicist, as a marketing professional. And for the Global AMR Diary, where, by the way, no money's changing hands, which is a really exciting part of this initiative. Everybody's working together collaboratively, and nobody's profiting. And the Partnership to Fight Infectious Disease agreed to host the website, and they're taking care of that because that's a big part of it. But on there's a note from me, and I put my email and I say, if anybody has a story to tell but needs help telling it, let me know, because that is going to be part of my work moving forward, is continuing to help people. I mean, I've been doing it on an informal basis since I started doing this work. When you go to a hospital and you visit patients, many of them, all they feel they have to offer is their story. People want to share their story that are sick. People who have been taking care of patients want to tell their stories of what it's like to take care of patients. The biotech innovators, they want to tell you what they've sacrificed, what they've given up, where their challenges are, what they're hoping to achieve, why they're driven to do this work. So it's really just a matter of taking the stories and then sharing them. And really, this is why we need Hollywood to come in and or Silicon Valley money to fund a production of a very important global film or television series that will really get to the mainstream, get to the masses, get to people outside the inner sanctum of the World Health, the CDC, these power players, these people who are sitting on all the information, but don't necessarily, and it's not lack of interest. Everybody wants this to work. Everybody wants to break out of this impasse we're at, but nobody really knows how to do it. And I am convinced you have to tell the stories and you have to share them in a way that you reach people, whether it's TikTok, social media. And I think that's how we're going to get worldwide attention on this issue, which, to be honest, when you're trying to talk to a reporter about AMR, which is sort of an invisible threat, and you've got people in Gaza or Israel or Ukraine, or you have a mother who's standing on a street corner when her 5-year-old's been gunned down by somebody in a gang. It's very hard to get attention and eyeballs on this. And this is a long-term problem that is not going away. One of the things I say when I speak is that Alexander Fleming, in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech in 1945, warned us that AMR was coming for us. It's just nobody listened. So this is not new news. This is just an inability to get this story told. So I'm very grateful. And I know everybody in the AMR world is going to be grateful when I tell them about this, because Silicon Valley is perceived to be a very important power player in the world. And if you put together some of the brightest minds, they could contribute to this.
Wow. So before we finish up the recording, you know, one of the key pieces of the story is the Global AMR Diary.
Yes.
Is that available online currently?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. We launched it the same day as Diary came out, May 7th.
Excellent. Okay. So I'll get that link from you and we'll add it to the material that people can access once they're on our pages. I'll wind things down and then hand it back to you. But for all of you who have taken time to watch this recording, we thank you. We thank you for being people who want to be inspired to help their communities in all sorts of ways, to learn that their stories are powerful for helping other people begin to see that they have it within them to make a difference in the lives of others. And we hope that you will share this particular recording as widely as you are able. Absolutely, the power of the story is where action begins. And so let us know your story. Let us know you were here. If you are on our SiliconValleyRotary.com page, at the very bottom, you can add a comment in the discuss forum. We welcome that opportunity in an online and asynchronous club to connect with you in that fashion. If you are curious to learn more about our club, go to rotary.cool and follow the links, and you'll find why it's important to us to reach out to people like Diane in order to share their stories. As we always like to do, we hand it back to our speaker for the final word. Diane, mic is yours.
I hope that your takeaway from this is that AMR is something to pay attention to. And I hope you'll read Diary of a Dying Girl and log on to the Global AMR Diary website to either share your stories or read some of the stories that have already been collected.
Thank you, Diane. And thank you, everyone. We will see you next week.
Thank you.